Has South Africa's diplomatic credibility taken another blow? First, Ambassador Rasool was shown the door. Then, Mcebisi Jonas, the president's special envoy to the United States, was denied a diplomatic visa. Now, with just 2 weeks to go before major US tariffs take effect, we have no ambassador, no recognized envoy, and no deal. Instead of addressing the crisis, the ANC seems to be going after Emma Powell, accusing her of spreading disinformation and pushing an anti government agenda on a trip to Washington in February of this year. Joining us to unpack what this all means is Chris Hattingh, Executive Director at the Center of Risk Analysis. Chris, so Emma Powell claims that both the visa denial and the rejection of the credentials were well known to the president as of May this year already. Yet we saw by June, President Ramaphosa was still defending Jonas as his North American envoy. What exactly does this tell us about how seriously the president is taking his diplomatic responsibilities, especially in the context of these looming tariffs that we've spoken about before?
Thanks, Anlu. Yeah, I suppose when one is unsure of one's position, when you've got to try and keep a party and a government and a cabinet together and try and keep everyone in your party from a factional point of view happy. And number two, when you see internationally, you don't get the purchase that your party did before. So, for example, when former President Nelson Mandela was president of the country, when the ANC and South Africa enjoyed the so-called democratic dividend and the idea of the rainbow nation idea, and the party could meet in Washington and New York and Europe and everywhere else and enjoy this great moral legitimacy and standing. When those you don't have those two things, when you've got number one, the domestic pressure, number two, the decline of international sort of not never mind prestige, but international comfort that and respect that you had before. One of the ways in which you deal with it is to lash out and to try and find scapegoats and excuses. Things like accusing DAMP Emma Powell of spreading quote unquote misinformation and disinformation about South Africa's domestic policies. And also, you don't take that sort of accountability from your own position and your own other cabinet ministers and performances and utterances that have contributed to South Africa being in this position. So, as the main example, the breakdown in relations between South Africa and the US has been coming a long time. Started before President Trump's first term, when you had, even in Democrat circles, more questioning of the relationship between South Africa and the US. Why would South Africa always vote against or abstain from votes put to the UN by the US? Why would South Africa align itself with countries like Iran when it talks about being non-aligned and neutral? Just more and more questioning. And now President Trump, in his second administration, really pushing the issue on the international stage, bringing to bear various pressure points on South Africa, and then placing President Ramaphosa in this position of always being on the defensive and trying to find other ways to deal with the pressure bearing down on him and on the ANC. Perhaps just the last point here, you see how this manifests maybe psychologically and just sort of tactically by the ANC and by DIRCO, the Department of International Relations specifically, where there will be at various points sort of statements by DIRCO representatives and others in government to say, no, we'll keep going to Washington, we'll engage with the US to explain our position. And that using that sort of terminology, say you're going to go explain and educate, presumes that you think Trump and his administration misunderstand something that will just fix the relationship. Again, it's coming from that more defensive point of view and also sort of trying to keep some kind of moral superiority point of view, where South Africa has this moral exceptionalism and you're going to rely on that to go and deal with the current tensions between your country and the US.
Yeah, you mentioned the defensible position, and I think a big part of defending yourself seems to be, well, is to actually deny the claims. But somehow there seems to be a bit of credibility behind the entire crisis, in the sense that Powell's claim wasn't actually denied by the president or the ANC. They instead looked at her to be a scapegoat. Is this a case of them trying to discredit the messenger because the message is indefensible, essentially? Or what is the actual case on the ground? Do we have somebody defending South Africa's case against many of these tariffs now?
I think you've had different representatives of South Africa in a non-state or non-official point of view or position trying to go to Washington and engage with both the Trump administration and businesses and others who have a sort of in terms of the government. I mean, I myself was in Washington in March this year, met with various think tanks and other non-government representatives where you try and you discuss what is the reality on the ground in South Africa. You present the data, which we often try and do at the CRA about the economy, state of society, declining quality of life, high rate of crime, and how that's tied into ANC government policy, which the ANC enjoyed a majority before last year's election, so they implemented their policy preferences, and that led to certain outcomes. I mean, every policy is downstream from ideology, so it's just a given that they implemented their policies and that South Africa is in this weaker economic position that it is now. So I think there continue to be various South Africans who put South African interest first, to try and go to places like Washington to try and figure out what can South Africa put forward from a trade and diplomatic point of view, but also what are the Trump administration's requirements? What from their point of view do they think needs to be done from the South African side, where the Trump administration has not become, but was always more transactional in its foreign policy and trade approach, whereas previous administrations would have maybe focused purely on sort of ideological focuses in its foreign policy and not been as harshly transactional in its engagements with countries like South Africa. Just a second point here to mention why in interpreting how the South African presidency, the Ramaphosa presidency, has reacted to how people such as Emma Powell and others have engaged in Washington, is both the statements by the presidency, but also by the spokesperson, Mr. Vincent Magwenya. I mean, in his statement, if you look at the kind of terminology used, he hit out against the DA and accused it of positioning itself, quote, as part of a right-wing nexus that seeks to use a foreign state to effect changes to democratically develop national policies in our own country, end quote. And in a separate press release, the ANC accused the DA of a, quote, racist smear campaign and of pursuing a regime change agenda under the guise of diplomacy, end quote. So it's trying to smear any criticism. And I'm not saying you shouldn't criticize sort of diplomatic engagements by quote unquote non-official state representatives. Engage with that, but also try and use those and support those as a way to engage with a more transactional Trump administration. This is a time in geopolitics that calls for more unconventional diplomacy. And I think the ANC hasn't sort of accepted that reality, and it's lashing out in these kinds of ways.
Yeah, and I see much of the pressure also pushed through the cracks in another area. Over the past few weeks, the ANC has been juggling police ministers like spare parts almost. We've had Senzo Machunu, who was suspended under clout, to Gwede Mantashe awkwardly perhaps stepping in. At the same time, Minister Kombucho Nsaveni raised eyebrows by suggesting that the state had identified individuals plotting a coup d'etat.
Because one of the risks is the risk of coup d'etat, to say there is a potential risk of a coup d'etat. We have identified it and we've put measures to mitigate against it.
But she offered very little details and then backtracked in the same breath by saying that no such attempt has yet been made. So rather than reassuring the public, this almost mixture of internal stability and alarmist language has added to the sense that the ANC is both divided and in the defensive position. Do you think there is a growing risk that as the ANC loses political control and perhaps some economic control, that it starts generating more of these distractions, not necessarily to deflect, but to justify perhaps them clamping down on political opposition under the banner of national security?
Absolutely. I think that's a very plausible scenario, not only to deflect, but also to actively try and manufacture or manifest scapegoats or targets, number one, that unites the party and keeps some, at least as many factions as possible, united, because there's then an external enemy or something that is attacking the ANC. So from the victimhood point of view, that's always useful psychologically. But also then number two, that you don't just deflect, but you actively use state resources and tools against your opponent. So I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but as its grip on power continues to slip, the ANC appears at least increasingly desperate. That means it can use things like state intelligence tools, state intelligence agencies, and others to either maintain control or to attack and undermine opposition. A big part of this is because the ANC has built so much of its support on patronage networks, cadre deployment. If you lose access to those state resources, you then over time, as the ANC and leadership of the ANC, your position becomes all the more difficult and untenable to maintain. So either you sow rumors and fears and uncertainty of things like a potential coup to increase your own control, and also to say that you should remain in control and in power because only you can deal with these kinds of things. Or number two, you then undermine any legitimate criticism by saying it's, trying to overthrow a quote unquote democratically elected government. Any criticism at all, whether it's data-based, ideologically based, anything is just dismissed out of hand. The party also, of course, has to deal with its leadership conference coming up in 2027, and for people like President Ramaphosa wanting to secure some kind of legacy still, the first African president to host G20, but an ANC leader to at least finish 2 terms and keep the party somewhat coherent. Personally, for him, the incentive is also there to assuage these different factions, and that could then manifest in ways like abusing the state intelligence services.
As we wrap up, how credible is the ANC's claim that they are monitoring a coup threat? And what does this actually signal about the state's actual capacity to respond to real threats should they materialize?
So the reports that the Minister in the Presidency, Ms. Nshaveni, highlighted, having spent the last week or so going through those in detail, and also in a previous conversation with Gideon Uber here on the CRA YouTube channel, we discussed the sort of coup d'etat possibility linked to the allegations floated by the KZN Police Commissioner, Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi. The reports themselves contain good parts, and also, as is often the case with government-produced analysis, very many bad parts and recommendations in terms of policy. So I think there's some nuggets of truth and some areas of use, but when it comes to implementation, I mean, the State Intelligence Services, the South African Police Service, the South African National Defence Force, broadly our intelligence and security capacities in South Africa have steadily declined over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years. We saw this manifest in July of 2021 in the riots in KwaZulu-Natal and Hattingh. We saw it in the performance of the South African National Defence Force in the DRC as part of a SADC quote-unquote peacekeeping mission. And you also see it just in the daily operations of our border security, border control, and our high rates of crime, where if one accepts one of the classical definitions of a state is to have a monopoly on power, a monopoly on the use of force. By that metric, the South African state isn't really a state in that kind of way. So when it comes to trying to defeat or deal with a potential coup d'etat, I don't see that things have changed since July 2021 to make me think there's now added capacity and indeed the elimination of previous elements that want to use the state intelligence against political opponents. So one of the many legacies of former President Jacob Zuma is how he used the state intelligence agencies against his political opponents. For people like Ramaphosa and others in his cabinet and in his faction in the ANC, I think that in many ways they're still unsure of who exactly in the state's security agency is linked and continues to support former President Jacob Zuma. That makes your day-to-day intelligence operations as a president very, very difficult. So it remains very murky and difficult, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to capacitate our state intelligence services to any kind of level to deal with potential coup d'etat. Now, whether I think a coup is realistic or not, I don't think it is, and mainly that is because I don't think that the military is politically captured. Part of that is also that the military has, unfortunately, in many ways been hollowed out. Even if you could capture it politically, you can't use it to secure things like communications, other key points that you would need to implement something like a coup. So in maybe a sort of unintended positive consequence, the consequence of things like cater deployment patronage that the ANC has implemented in things like the SANDF, the police service, the intelligence, those can't then be abused in the most sort of negative dictatorship kind of way against South African citizens. But ideally, we do want them to function, because you do need to secure your borders, to implement security, deal with crime, all that kind of thing on a daily basis.
Well, in conclusion, what we're seeing is a government under pressure and a ruling party that's increasingly unable to distinguish between its own survival and our national interest. Chris, thank you for your analysis. To our viewers, stay tuned for more expert takes on the risks shaping our world. That's from us at the CRA. Until next time.